Hi, Paul.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Good. How are you doing?
Can't complain. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show on Meaning of Life TV. And you are Paul Froese, a sociologist at Baylor University, and you've written a book that definitely belongs on Meaning of Life TV. It's called On Purpose, How We Create the Meaning of Life. It's published by Oxford University Press. It's not a coincidence that it's the same color as the wall behind you. Is that correct?
That's true. That's true. It's all a big plan, a master plan.
There's a larger plan that your life is part of, which we'll discuss the idea that there is a larger plan that imparts purpose. But first, why don't we elaborate? I mean, you asked them to use the color of your wall on the book jacket. Is that right?
I did, and they did it,
And
which
they
is
did it.
surprising.
That is shocking. I think I want to be published by Oxford from now on if they'll do things like that for you. It's a nice color.
Well, you know, the color to me, I wanted to kind of exude a kind of a calm sense,
Yeah.
and I also tried to do that in the writing.
Yeah, no. So you calm down a little when you look at the jacket because of the color. Then
Yeah,
you start reading it, and it's just out and out sedation.
supposed to relax, so it's a good book to read before bed.
Well, we don't want it to be too good to read, but it's actually very lively. The writing is actually very, very lively and kind of staccato. It's
Well,
good.
that's that makes me feel so good because you're such a good writer. In fact, I was going to ask you about your writing. I think maybe because of your training as a journalist, it seems like you have such a good grasp of audience in your writing voice. It's really wonderful.
But enough about me. I do think it is arguably good for one's writing not to be trained as an academic, but you know I don't mean that
True.
in an
That's very,
offensive way. But academics, well, experts of all kinds who are used to communicating with an expert audience have trouble remembering what they can't assume on the part of a larger audience. You know, what assumptions the larger audience doesn't bring to the conversation.
and we're desperately fearful of being called out on little things.
Right, that too.
Yeah. So we over explain and
And
we
overqualify.
we overqualify things. That's true.
Right. But you don't in this. I mean, for better or worse, maybe it'll hurt your academic reception, but it's a very lively read. And you were commendably restrained in footnote type elaboration. Actually, there's a lot of elaborate footnotes at the end. Maybe that's the key, is that you consigned a lot of your elaboration to the end notes.
That really is the key because in writing it was maybe 4 times as long as what you have, and I just crunched it and then dropped a lot of things into footnotes.
Yeah. Well, it works well.
Good. Thank you.
So, how we create the meaning of life. That's what the book is about. You've done a lot of research on this, about how people think about meaning in their lives and the connection between meaning and the notion of purpose. And you've looked at a lot of literature on the connection between meaning and a sense of meaning and happiness and all these other sociological variables.
Mm-hmm.
And you've distilled it into this, and that's what we're going to talk about. Now, for starters, do you more or less equate the idea of a meaningful life with the idea of a purposeful life? Or is it more that people naturally do that? I mean, at one point you kind of define purpose as I think the meaning that people give to an experience.
Yes, yes. And then my focus was kind of what the meaning of life is, the purpose of life. So you're right, I'm kind of using those interchangeably, which maybe is a mistake, but that's kind of the route I went. I think when I was beginning it, I was kind of interested in people's moral worldviews.
Mm-hmm.
And then in kind of looking at it more deeply, I thought, well, how do people popularly talk about that? And I kind of landed on the word purpose. And it shows up in a lot of kind of self-help literature. And the question, what is your purpose in life, is something that people, I think, is a common question. It might be difficult to answer, but it's a common question. And in asking people that question, I think what you're really getting at and what you're really revealing is their moral worldview.
So if and I mean to some extent their religious worldview, right? I mean, you definitely get into that, the connection between religious and one thing you say about, what is the term you use, moral egoism?
Yes.
That we are all, that people are by nature moral egoists.
Yes.
And,
yes.
and what do you mean by that?
Well, I think there's kind of, sometimes there's a tension in kind of the micro foundations of sociology and economics, and that is, at root, are humans kind of rational egoists, instrumentally rational and working through the world, or are they these kind of moral believing animals or value rational creatures? And clearly we're both. And so I'm trying to combine these kind of two micro foundations into one and saying, well, we're moral egoists. And what that means is that we seek moral order out of self-interest. So it's in our self-interest to be embedded in a moral order, because that's what gives us purpose. And it tells us what we should do. And
to feel that we are being moral ourselves, that we are aligned with moral truth and goodness.
Yes, exactly. And so I really do agree with kind of Christian Smith's phrase that we're moral believing animals, and you've written similar things. And that, to me, what that means is that we naturally just see the world, perceive the world in moral terms. And so because of that, one of the things that we want is we want to feel good about ourselves. We want to feel good about ourselves in the world. And to me, that's the essence of moral egoism.
So then, to live a meaningful life, is it your view, or maybe the view of people in general, that to live a meaningful life is to live a moral life? I mean, is that almost, could you almost distinguish a meaningful life from a merely happy life or a merely pleasurable existence that way?
Yeah, exactly. A meaningful life and a morally meaningful life to me are synonymous. I'm kind of treating that as the same thing.
Now, are there happy people who would say they don't live meaningful lives, or is this kind of moral orientation so pervasive that you just almost never find somebody who says, I'm happy? I mean, there are psychopaths, of course, but they would not admit that they're not moral, so they don't count. I mean, yeah. I guess I'm asking, you know, if there are people, or maybe are there happy nihilists? Are there happy people who think there's no such thing as moral truth?
I think so. However, I mean, and this is maybe more philosophical, I would tend to argue, and it's a definitional thing, is that you might intellectually have a kind of a perspective that you're a nihilist or something, but probably if you're living a happy and satisfying life, you're probably embedded in a community that makes you feel good about yourself, that maybe even shares your sense of nihilism. Mm-hmm. And so I would describe that as a kind of a moral community, a moral universe in which what you're inhabiting, even though intellectually you're saying, well, I don't really believe in anything greater than myself or any kind of objective morality.
And in fact, if you are devoted to spreading a nihilistic worldview with your fellow nihilists, then you have an explicit purpose.
Exactly, exactly. And so, for instance, you know, the college professor who is a nihilist or wants to kind of preach in his or her classroom about the meaninglessness of it all, I think if that person is happy and self-satisfied, they're probably gaining some sort of moral support from their department, from their academic peers. They're getting some sort of positive feedback from their students and what they're saying. And so there is a moral community there that's supporting them.
Okay.
Even if they want to deny that.
Okay. So you mentioned there the idea of being kind of part of something bigger or something like that. And you quote in the book Martin Seligman, who's known for kind of starting the positive psychology movement, saying that belonging to and serving something that you believe is bigger than the self is an essential part of living a meaningful life, or maybe that's his very definition of it. But anyway, he kind of equates that with meaning, something bigger than the self.
Yes. And I agree with that. I agree with that. And in fact, I think, okay, let me back up and say, one of the things, I began with just simply asking people, what is your purpose in life? And my intent there was be like, okay, what the heck does this word purpose mean to people? The only way I can get at that is you ask them this question and you kind of listen to what they're saying. Now, many people have kind of a religious answer, serving Christ or something like this. A lot of people will immediately reference family or friends, loved ones. A lot of people will refer to their profession or their career. And I think if you look at these are various answers. There's diversity there, but I think what the commonality in all of these answers is it's placing yourself within some sort of moral structure. I matter in the world for these reasons. And then the answer kind of reveals what people think is morally important, what isn't.
So this can be larger relationships. There are people who depend on me, whose lives I enrich. It can be a team of people devoted to a purpose. It can be a larger theological thing. There's God's plan that I'm part of, but it's larger. It would be hard to find people who have what you would call meaningful lives, or what they would call meaningful lives probably, who don't have anything like that. Yes,
and I think, to me, again, I'm a sociologist, so morality is always a collective project. You know, Durkheim has a great line that says, well, the individual cannot create good and bad, you know, sacred and profane. There's simply too little. You have to have something bigger than the self to start to understand these kinds of concepts of morality, good and evil, sacred, profane.
Okay, so one thing you report is that people who believe their life has a purpose are happier, right?
Yes. Yes, and that's a kind of a common finding in a lot of psychological research.
And that's when the question is asked that way, does your life have purpose?
Exactly.
So then the question becomes, what does purpose mean? And it can mean a lot of different things. I mean, we've hinted at the possible breadth of it.
Yes.
But there's another finding in your book that makes a distinction between knowing your purpose and believing that your purpose is part of a larger plan. I mean, this is like a survey question. It's like these are two separate questions. You don't get the same. The answers don't necessarily coincide.
No. I'm guessing the purpose is part of a larger plan. It kind of has religious overtone to it, and that clearly is the case. That's the people who answered that positively tend to be religious or spiritual in some way. Whereas, really, what I was testing there was, am I just picking up when people say I have a purpose in life? Does that assume a kind of a religious sense to that word? And I think what I found was, you know, secular people will say they have a purpose in life. So it's not really a word that necessarily implies religion. But when you say purpose is part of the larger plan, it tends to have a religious overtones.
Yeah, and one interesting thing in that finding is that, okay, so you distinguish between religious people and spiritual people. I presume religious people have some kind of affiliation with one of the religions we've heard of. The spiritual people don't have that identity, but say, I am spiritual. In other words, these are the spiritual but not religious people?
I didn't break down the data like that, but, you know, I could do that. But there tends to be an overlap. They're correlated. People say they're religious and spiritual, but they have kind of more distinct meanings. And in fact, people have looked at those kinds of survey questions over, let's say, the last 50 years and collecting survey questions on those things. What's really interesting is that 50 years ago, people weren't, at least Americans, weren't making a kind of distinction between the word religion and spiritual. Right. And now it's become this kind of a way of defining yourself as having some sort of, I guess, attachment to the supernatural, but not within an organized religion. And so they're becoming more and more distinct, but they're not wholly distinct.
And I would say we don't know that everyone who calls himself spiritual is referring to the supernatural, right? I mean, in just casual conversation, I find that people mean quite a large... I get the sense that a lot of people would like to be able to say they're spiritual, even if they have no religious belief. And even if they haven't thought much about what spiritual means. And maybe that's just because they kind of equate it with moral. I don't know. But
yeah,
I think you get an array of people. Well, I think that the word refers to an array of kinds of beliefs. But what I found interesting was that in your, and I don't know if this is your finding or somebody else's, maybe it's yours, but it's that spiritual people are almost or just about as likely to say that they believe that their purpose is part of a larger plan as religious people. There's almost no difference in the correlation.
That's right.
And that surprised me, because I did think that for a lot of people, spiritual means something super vague, not necessarily that there's a purpose to anything. But maybe I'm wrong, and maybe you're right that most people who use the term spiritual are talking about something very religious-like supernatural.
I don't know. I mean, I think just in my own kind of research and my own just doing interviews and whatnot, spiritual to me often evoke, well, first of all, the person tends to want to communicate that they don't want to be grouped with some sort of organized religion or some sort of identity within a denomination or a tradition. But it also tends to mean that the person has had some kind of, I'm using the word religious, but religious experience or religious feeling. And what that to me means is almost a numinous experience, an attachment to something that they feel is outside of them. So, for instance, sitting and listening to, a beautiful piece of music can evoke all kinds of emotionality and feeling, and you feel kind of connected with something bigger, and that can have a kind of a spiritual overtone to it, which fits with this word larger plan, a larger something, a larger meaning. And so maybe that's what that question's picking up on.
Yeah, that makes sense. This was your own work, the data I just referred to?
Yes.
That's your stuff.
Yes,
okay.
Yes. Confusing, because in the book I present original analysis that I'm doing, but I'm also kind of cataloging research of other people.
Yeah, well, that's what gives the book its breadth. You would want to do that.
Yes.
I applaud that. So there's a sentence in your book that I think is important in characterizing kind of a lot of the argument of the book. You say, I argue that history, norms of self, communities of truth, cultural tempos, and power dynamics determine how each of us understands the meaning of life. So I think it's worth spending some time kind of unpacking this and maybe going over it item by item. So can you give us an example of how one of these kind of these variables, your history or your norms of self or cultural tempos, what you mean by these kinds of things and how they might influence your conception of meaning?
Yes. Great question. So one of the things I wanted to do, or the theme throughout the book, is I'm trying to show how social context affects how we think of the meaning of life. And that question can be exploded in infinite numbers of ways. So I kind of honed in on different topics that were interesting to me, and each chapter kind of deals with each. So one, I'm kind of looking at the process of modernization or history and how that changed our sense of what the self means. And really, modernization, and especially in the post-industrial world, we have this idea of self-discovery, which I argue wasn't always kind of around. It's a modern invention that there's a self that needs to be discovered, and clearly this vast self-help industry is evidence of the post-industrial need for self-discovery. So that's kind of one example of how a social force, a large social force like modernization, affects our sense of purpose. But then I look at other things. So for instance, the chapter on time, I'm trying to think about how cultural variation affects how we think about ourselves. And there are many measures of culture, but I thought it was kind of interesting to look at how different cultures have different senses of time, different senses of social time. And so, for instance, in our world, social time moves very quickly. And a lot of people feel overwhelmed, and they feel like they have to move from task to task to task to task. And maybe they don't have time to think about the larger meaning of things or the larger purpose, or if there's some sort of bigger plan. But my argument in that chapter is they're still within a meaning context, which is providing a purpose to their lives, even if they're not cognizant of it. And the meaning is stay on pace, keep going, try to progress. And maybe they don't verbalize that or articulate it, but it's still there.
But then, and that in turn, I mean, this is not so much within your scope maybe, but that in turn gives rise to certain kinds of stress and anxiety, the imperative, the sense that there's always more you could do. I mean, it seems to me that is characteristic of modern life for a lot of people. It used to be you went to work at 9, you came back at 5, you were done. There's now, wherever you are, you could be doing more for your career, or you could be doing more socially, because you could reach out to anyone, anywhere, you know. And so, and I think that that creates, you know, stress for some people, which in turn becomes the kind of thing, the stress becomes the kind of thing that can be addressed by spiritual leaders, or maybe by what you call the purpose industry, which is a whole lot of people, religiously, you know, self-help, so on. So yeah, I guess I'm certainly buying your thesis that modern times have influenced the whole search for meaning.
Yeah, and I say that, like, in the search for meaning, or the search for, I mean, this gets back to an earlier question that you had about the kind of the connection between happiness and meaning. But like I quote Seneca, who says, well, one of the universal problems that goes throughout time is the fear of death, right? The sense that, you know, because we die, everything really is meaningless. And, you know, like, what is the purpose of anything? Because eventually you'll be dead and it doesn't matter. So dealing with that deep feeling of despair can be addressed in different ways. So religions try to do it by, well, you live on into an afterlife, and then so everything just keeps going. And people who've studied myth, like Joseph Campbell, say, well, the kind of narratives of heroes and evil villains give a sense that morality is around forever, and so you want to live a heroic life, and that somehow that will carry on. Well, Seneca argued, well, the best way to deal with that is diversions. Keep your mind off of it. And so maybe that's something that's very ubiquitous in our post-industrial world. Hey, we don't have to worry about death. Why? We got so many distractions. You never have to think about it, because you're always thinking about the next thing on your to-do list.
That is actually probably true, yeah. So maybe we should be thankful for this. So
until you come to the end and you realize, oh, what was I doing all that time?
Right. There's that downside. Why didn't I spend more time with my kids and so on?
Yeah.
So you also mentioned that you talk about how modernization changes the conception of God. You say it won't kill God. I guess at least you mean for substantial numbers of people, it won't kill the idea of God, but it changes the kind of people, the kind of God people imagine.
Yes.
So what is the tendency there? And this is to some extent based on cross-cultural stuff, where you have societies at different levels of economic and development and educational attainment and so on. But what's the finding there?
Yeah. So the book before I wrote this one was America's Four Gods, and that was an attempt to kind of catalog different variations on what people think of when they say the word God. And one of the findings there were, or at least there's a lot of variation in God, as you well know. You've written very nicely on this topic. But the finding there was, in terms of how engaged God is with the world and how judgmental God is of the world, there's tremendous variation. And people in the more kind of post-industrial world those who've kind of retained a belief in God, whatever that means, tend to have what I call a more distant God, a God that you might be able to talk to through prayer, but isn't really performing miracles or saving people from cancer or winning wars or determining the outcome of football games. That really is a God of maybe the pre-modern world. So as the world modernized, what my argument is God becomes more distant in terms of acting in the world. We now rely more on science or psychology to answer those kinds of questions, but God still remains. And my definition of God, I was kind of interested in reading your book of the evolution of God, is I think of, or at least the word God, as really at its core a belief that there is some sort of moral singularity to everything. And so that obviously can take so many different varieties, with some being very kind of concrete senses of he's like a white guy with a beard and he does all these kinds of things, versus, well, God to me is the Big Bang, or something very kind of abstract like that. And for that reason, I think the concept of God is, here to stay, even though I know that atheism is on the rise.
So a common idea is that God is, that first of all, there is a moral order. There is such thing as moral truth, and God is in some sense the source of that, or the wellspring of that, or
yes,
or maybe the ultimate way to think about that, or something.
Well, and if we talk about it in evolutionary terms, it seems to me that there is a natural tendency in humans. They want to understand things. They want things to become comprehensible. And so it's a very natural process to say, as we begin to understand, wow, there's this enormous universe and it has all these aspects to it. And oh my God, it's like it's becoming so complicated that I can't wrap my head around it. Oh, maybe it has some sort of singularity to it at its essence, God. And that to me is a very kind of logical thing to kind of come to.
And you also say, I think, that the God of kind of modernity is not so inclined to favor a particular nation, right?
Yes. Although clearly in post-industrial societies you have strong, fervent nationalism, which does tend to get connected to religion. So, there's a counter trend there, I think, that nationalists tend to not only think, well, my country, my nation has some sort of historic, greatness to it, but it's also connected, and its historic destiny is connected to something even bigger, and that tends to be God.
Yeah, and I mean, nationalism can intensify and wane, and I guess you would see correspondence there with conceptions of God. Okay, so there's a one of many interesting sentences in your book is this one: modern humans imagine new sacred canopies that seek to unite humanity in a shared purpose. Here are three such fantasies: one cause, one God, one reality. Now, are you saying these are ways that people have articulated that we might hope to see all of humankind live in harmony through, or?
Yeah, I mean, so.
And the word fantasies, by the way, is not auspicious. It sounds to me in terms of what you think their chances of success are. We got kind of a plot spoiler there, but sorry, go ahead and elaborate.
Yeah. In that chapter, cross purposes, I'm kind of really going out on a limb in that chapter, but I'm making the argument that there is a tendency, and this is not necessarily a negative tendency. It might even be a very good tendency, that we want to unite people under kind of a shared sense of something. And so I picked that there's a tendency to want to unite people around a single political cause, right? Like, this is what the good society should be, and if we could all just get on board, we could make it happen. Similarly, people want to unite each other around a singular sense of the sacred, one God. If we could all just believe in this God, we could love each other. And then finally, I kind of use this on kind of rational materialists.
That's what you mean by one reality.
One reality, in that there's a sense that, well, if everybody could just stop fantasizing in their religions and all this stuff and just become scientists, we could all just agree on what reality is, and then we can get on with things. And so my argument in that chapter is these might be noble causes, but they're always going to fail, because human perception and creation of meaning is always diverse. Mm-hmm. You're never going to get total worldwide consensus on the perceptions of what the good society is, what the supernatural reality of the world, or even what the material reality of the world is.
Yeah, it's the third of those that, in a way, particularly interests me. I mean, I think there's, a fair amount of kind of evidence as you just look around casually, anecdotal evidence, that the first two categories are indeed problematic. I mean, as far as one cause, people clearly have very different ideas about how to structure society, policies that make sense, and so on. This isn't an especially good point in history to say that, hey, I think, everybody seems to believe they all worship the same God. No, they don't seem to believe that. But this one reality thing, the kind of scientific materialism, I guess, I mean, this is something you hear in particular from the so-called new atheists, I would say. I mean, old atheists, atheists in general have not necessarily been, evangelizers of scientific materialism. I mean, some of them have been like, in fact, there have been kind of regretful atheists who thought, well, geez, it might be better if everybody believed in God, but let's get real. So they've been in no hurry to spread some kind of gospel of secularism, some of them. But the new atheists are kind of evangelical, and they do seem to believe that if we could all just be scientific materialists or rationalists, as you say, that would somehow end the conflict in the world. For my own reasons, I don't buy it, but elaborate a little on what you think the problem is with this.
It's just, I think it fails to realize that each individual is constantly trying to create their meaningful life in their own way. And so to impose, so for instance, I think what upsets me about some of the new atheists is they kind of have this, like, I'm the smartest kid in the classroom, and if you idiots would just listen to me, you would figure it out, right? But what I would like to say to them is, look, go to a third world country where you are struggling to get clean water and you're worried that your child is going to die, and you grasp on to a sense that there's a loving God above you, and this is going to help you through your day. And some white guy in the United States is going to point at them and say, you moron, can't you see that's a fantasy? That, to me, it's offensive. And it also doesn't even scientifically start to look at what is the reality of that person. And morally, why the hell can't they believe that? I think is, sometimes I get really angry with the new atheists because I feel like they're kind of uncaring in a way.
There is kind of a hard edge to some of that rhetoric. And there's also the fact that, look, if you think grabbing one of these people by the shoulders and saying, don't you understand your God doesn't exist, if you think that's going to make them less likely to believe in their God, you are the opposite of correct.
Totally.
There's plenty of literature suggesting that the more people feel their worldview is threatened, the more likely they are to move toward the fundamentalists.
Well, my first book was called The Plot to Kill God, and it was all about how the Soviets tried to extinguish religion and how that failed. And I think the most concise statement of that was by Stalin, who said, religion is like a nail. The harder you hit it, the deeper it goes. And I think that's true. I think that's true.
I think it is. So, let's see.
You know, I want to talk about moral imagination.
Oh.
And I mean, that's a phrase in your book. And I also, you have a line about that you feel that there's moral progress being made in the world.
Of a kind. Well, I think over the long sweep of history, there has been a certain kind of moral progress that, you know, it can wax and wane in the short term, and there can be backsliding. But the basic trend I'm talking about has been noted by others. I mean, Peter Singer wrote a book called The Expanding Circle about the fact that, you know, if you go back to 500 BCE, the members of one Greek city-state would say that members of another Greek city-state were subhuman. And then they decided, no, all Greeks are people. It's just the Persians who are, you know, and so on.
Yeah.
And so over time, you know, there's been an erratic expansion of this kind of this circle of moral consideration. You know, the number of people you consider human beings who deserve some minimum in the way of respect and rights, assuming that they don't do something egregious. And I had a particular kind of way of explaining that, and other people have had different ways. But the trend has been noted by many people that today, you and I and most of the people we know would say everyone of any race, creed, or color has basic rights, deserves basic respect, and so on. And we don't, in the modern world, we don't pause to realize that that was once pretty much unheard of if you go back a few thousand years. And that if you go back 1,000 or even 500 years, it was much rarer than it is, at least in many societies today.
You know, what's interesting about that is that I think you're right, but then I also think there's the belief component, and then there's the action component, right? Is that, let's say Americans overall, they say, you know, every human has worth and everyone has human rights, and we have the UN Charter of Human Rights, but, you know, we'll still bomb people, we'll still bomb civilians. And so there's something about that rhetoric as being somehow more open-minded or more sympathetic to others and others' plights. But the reality of, like, kind of geopolitical politics is we still have wars, and we still bomb people, we still kill people, we still exploit people, and maybe we don't feel personally responsible, but these larger systems aren't necessarily indications of moral progress.
Right. I mean, I think there's some truth to that. Now, Steve Pinker, who wrote this book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, I don't know if you've looked at that, but he would argue, and he's, you know, looked into the data, and he would contend that, granted kind of what you said, it is still the case that number of people who died violently as a percentage of the world's population has declined over time. And he goes through in basic human rights and so on, and argues that even there you can see progress. What I would say, just independent of that, is I would concede and emphasize the point that there's a distinction between honoring these values in principle and in statement, and actually honoring them, you know, in your life, and one of the and in your policies, and in your country's policies. And one of the problems, I mean, is, you know, I said, you know, we now have this idea that everyone deserves basic human rights, assuming they don't do anything egregious. Well, one problem is we're the ones who define what's egregious, right? It's like, I mean, this is in a way a subset of a larger problem, that it seems to be a human intuition built into us by natural selection that good deeds should be rewarded, bad deeds should be punished. And in principle, that could be on balance probably a healthy thing to live by. The problem is we're the ones who define what the good deeds are and the bad deeds are. And once we consider a group of people enemies, we think that the bad they've done outweighs the good, and there's a whole range of kind of cognitive biases we start using to evaluate them once we consider them enemies. So I want to, although I think Steve Pinker may be right that things, if you look at the data, are better than we think, I still want to emphasize the point you made that it's not enough to swear allegiance to these high-minded principles, that we all should be very vigilant and kind of skeptical of our own judgment in deciding how we implement the values. And
yes.
That's one reason I emphasize in that book the cultivation of moral imagination. I mean, I think that's almost like a spiritual discipline in itself. It's so hard to kind of put yourself in the shoes of people that you consider enemies or that you have no particular reason to consider allies.
Well, and there's a kind of a paradox here, because you imagine in this kind of pre-modern setting, like I might have hatred for this other tribe, but I also have some sort of nearness to them, and so my hatred has a reality to it in that they might be coming at me and I'm going at them, whereas in our modern setting, I think we've exploded the problem that I think Niebuhr brings up in this Moral Man in Moral Society, is that we can live under this kind of delusion that we're more moral because within our neighborhoods, I'm a nice guy, and and people like me, and I say hello, and if somebody's car breaks down, I help them, and I'm a moral person. But to what extent, and this is maybe a philosophical question, am I responsible for all kinds of evil that systems are doing around the globe because I'm now aware of them too, or at least I can be aware of them if I want to be? To what extent do I have responsibilities for that, and to what extent does that affect how moral I can feel about myself?
Right. I mean, your tax dollars are definitely going to kill civilians. This year, a fair number. Now, maybe Steve Pinker's right, not a large number by historical standards, but more than I'd like. And I mean, is that the kind of thing you mean? And I guess, some people would also argue that in your consumption habits, you are sometimes subsidizing, child labor or...
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. No,
so I'm not proposing an answer to any of this, but it's just an interesting question about whether there's progress in morality, and maybe my sense of this is that human groups always create moral systems. To what extent is one moral system better than another? That's a good question. Like, how do we determine that?
Well, right, and I personally think that this may catch me up in some kind of logical paradox to say this, but I personally think part of being moral is not to be too casually judgmental in that very regard.
Yes.
In other words, to when you first look at another society, recognize it's a different society from yours. They have come to where they are from a different place, and that you'd have to do a pretty comprehensive survey of the society before you could be very confident that the set of norms as a whole was inferior to your set of norms. I think you should never lose sight of the kinds of problems we have. There are people who look at various societies around the world and consider them primitive, but sometimes there are problems we have that they don't have in terms of number of children born to poor unwed parents, rate of incarceration, whatever. And it seems to me, a moral system, a normative system should be appraised as a whole. There are a lot of interconnections.
Yeah.
And
well, okay, so this actually leads me to one finding that I had that you'll remember in the book is that there are groups of people in post-industrial societies that have less meaning in their lives than even the poorest of the poor around the world. And so that's kind of a head scratcher. It's like, well, what's going on there? Is this just kind of how the data is, how do you collect data on this all around the world? So I kind of make the argument that even in really poor societies where people are struggling, they tend to still have moral communities in which maybe you struggle together to kind of achieve something. Whereas one of maybe the moral failings of very progress-driven cultures is that the people on the peripheries no longer have these similar attachments to community, and they can drift out and have meaningless lives. And so, for instance, people on Fox News and whatnot, they like to point out that, well, the poor in the United States, they have like refrigerators and air conditioning. Some of them have iPhones, and so what the hell are they complaining about? But what my data shows is the poor in our societies, they might have those kinds of things that others around the world don't, but in the exchange, they oftentimes lose a sense of meaning. And maybe that's because they're living in a culture that sees them as valueless, as something that can be left behind. And all that Fox News does is perpetuate that idea when they make claims like that.
Yeah, you mentioned a finding in your book that is it Liberia, where there were like 1,000 people surveyed and nobody suffered from a meaning shortage? I mean, huge poverty. Although I think it was a range of people who were surveyed. Probably it probably cut across Liberian society. But one problem nobody had was a lack of meaning. Yes.
And so I kind of have two explanations for that. One, I think it is connected to this idea of a kind of a sacred canopy that does cover less modern countries. In other words, there tends to be religious systems of meaning that people just kind of accept out of hand, and that does imbue you, even if you're at the lowest rung of society, with some sense of meaning, like there's some sort of higher power at play here. And two, and this is true across all societies, people who say they feel a part of a community are more likely to say they have a meaningful life. And that was really true in these kind of agrarian, very poor societies. People still felt attached to community, whereas poor people in post-industrial societies were much less likely to say they felt attached to some sort of community.
Yeah. Well, and if you look at these people who commit these mass shootings, I mean, two things strike you. One is often they are not embedded in what we would call a wholesome community. And the other thing is that often they do the shooting, they construct some kind of cause. The shooting itself becomes embedding themselves in some kind of purpose, whether it's a kind of a well-structured, larger one like jihadism, or one they just kind of make up or cobble together from like video games and stuff. It's oddly very rare that they seem to think of the killing itself as a meaningless act.
I agree.
So let's see. There's a couple of things I wanted to touch on. One is maybe just in passing. There's a really interesting line early on, I think, where you say the act of looking becomes interesting only when it is purposeful. You remember that?
Okay, yeah.
You'll have to take my word for it. You said it.
Okay.
And the reason that's interesting to me, I mean, first of all, it resonates with my experience. I mean, I find, like I'm not the kind to just pick up a book about history and go, oh, this is fascinating, and read it cover to cover. But if I'm writing an argument about history myself, then it's fascinating because I'm looking for things that fit into my argument.
Yes.
And then it's purposeful looking.
Yes.
But what struck me about this is that I don't know if you have much contact with the whole mindfulness meditation movement. It's hard to avoid it these days, right?
Yeah.
A lot of people do, but in a way, that your observation is central to the mindfulness movement because there is the observation that ordinarily we pay attention to only things we are interested in by virtue of our own individual purposeful connection to them. And yet the prescription with mindfulness meditation is to somehow kind of let go of that, right? Is to make your perceptions, to just perceive for the sake of perception in a certain sense.
Yes. Well, it's attempting to destroy the self, right? Destroy the ego. And I mean, it's an awesome idea, but I don't know if you can do it.
Yeah, I think
I do want to. On this note, it's a fun thing to play with, or at least to try to be mindful of. is what do I focus on in life? And that is revealing to me my priorities, right? My kind of moral worldview. So recently I started reading Karl Ove Knausgaard's, 7-volume autobiography. I don't know if you're familiar.
He's like the Scandinavian guy who's very avant-garde and suddenly in vogue.
Yes. And he's in vogue for good reason, because I think. Is he good? Oh, he's brilliant.
I mean, when I see one of these artsy photographs of a supposedly great writer smoking a cigarette, I just totally dismiss them. But if you tell me he's a great writer, I will take your word for it.
Well, and so this is, to me, what his writing revealed to me is he writes about the most mundane aspects of daily life, right? Kind of in a Proustian way, right? Mm-hmm. And what this does is, or at least what revealed to me is, oh my God, all of these little things that I'm ignoring are full of meaning if I pay attention. And maybe that's the same thing of mindfulness. And maybe that's what mindfulness in a real world way does, is it kicks you in the butt and says, hey, start to pay attention to stuff. And what you're going to find is little things might have meaning that you hadn't thought about before.
Right.
And maybe it's important.
And pay attention in a disinterested way. In other words, don't ask, what can this thing do for me? Because if you're asking, what can this thing do for me, which is the way we ordinarily go around perceiving the world, naturally, we're designed to do that by natural selection. First of all, you're going to ignore most of the world, because most of the world can't do anything for you.
Yes.
And also, when you do look at something from the point of view of what it can do for you, then as Buddhists would say, it's in a kind of a grasping way, and you're still not seeing the thing in itself.
Yes. Yes.
So maybe I'll revise my opinion of him in light of this.
You at least have to read a couple pages before you can dismiss him.
Okay. Yeah, I guess again, there's a kind of circularity I'm caught up in, I think, here. Yeah. So.
Well, this to me also gets at one of the problems I had is I'm writing a book that's kind of about. It's about the meaning of life and purpose and all this stuff. And I think a reader might naturally want, back to this thing, what's in it for me, right? Why should I read this book? And I think maybe one of the failings of the book is I don't have any kind of suggestions in terms of what you as an individual can do to have a more meaningful life, have a happier life, have more contentment. But rather, I guess it's just a call to say, maybe it's of interest, maybe it could even be therapeutic, I don't know, to start to think deeper about these issues.
There's the suggestion that we can create our own meaning. I mean, on the one hand, the kind of meaning we have tends to bear some correlation to our demographic circumstances, but on the other hand, it's you're clear on the fact that ultimately we're kind of generating this thing in some sense, or at least and maybe have more power to generate it once we recognize that that's what's going on. I don't know.
Yes, that's probably true. I would think that's true. And that, I end the book with this whole discussion of imagination, and the fact that even if, you're wholly, let's say you're like a true believer in some established religion, which in some sense is pre-packaging everything for you, you're still bending it in your own particular way. You're still bending it to your own individual life. And so even, the devout person is going to be a little bit different from the devout person sitting right next to them, simply because they've had different experiences and have the capacity to imagine different things.
On the other hand, when you say that our imagination creates meaning, will that for some people induce some kind of crisis? I mean, people tend to go around kind of casually thinking that the meaning is just there, right? They're perceiving it. And it's funny, some people would find it empowering to think I create my own meaning. And in any event, that's been a response. I mean, I gather that that's kind of existentialist philosophy kind of goes there, although I'm not an expert on that. And so it's kind of, and some people find it empowering. Some people might rather not think about it that way. I don't know.
Well, I think one of the problems is I could see somebody reading my book and say, well, this guy, you know, like he's a social constructionist, and what this means is that everything is fabricated, and so nothing is real, and really real. And what I don't know quite how to put this, but my thinking on the matter is that what you feel is real to you, and so that's your reality. And even if some neuroscientists can connect that to your brain structure, that doesn't remove the feeling and the meaning that things have to you. And so there is, if you feel something deep in your heart, that's what reality is. And I'm not questioning that.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
That made any sense. But
yeah, definitely. Maybe one more question before we go. You were at Baylor University, historically a Southern Baptist university. Now, I'm sure there's a diversity of students there these days, but I would think there's a non-trivial number of deeply religious evangelicals there even today. I'm just wondering if you've probably been teaching this kind of stuff there for years, including your research. I'm wondering if do you get feedback from these kinds of students, and is maybe feedback a more gentle word than is it more like blowback, or what's that been like?
You know what, it's interesting. I've never really had much conflict. You would think I would, because, you know, to be honest, when I teach my undergraduate sociology religion class, you know, if you look at it, you're like, well, this guy's teaching kind of a social construction of reality. Mm-hmm. You know, so religion is a collective invention, essentially. But I also do that with a tremendous amount of respect for religion. So I try to combine the two, and I find that really devout believers tend not to have a big problem with that. Now, it also might be a sampling bias in that I'm getting sociology students, and they might look different from other, you know, maybe a religion student on campus. But I really never run into a problem. But it goes back to respect, I think. So when I first started teaching sociology religion, I was at the University of Washington, so it's a secular public university, and I kind of snidely said something about Jehovah's Witnesses in the class. Mm. And after the class, a woman came up to me and she said, "I'm a Jehovah's Witness, and I just want to talk to you about this." And that was a big game changer for me. I was like, I can't. Sociology is not about ridiculing people. It's about trying to understand people. And I think if you exude that, even if you're kind of promoting a kind of a very sociological approach to religion, people can accept that.
Okay, well, that's very interesting. So, again, the book is On Purpose, How We Create the Meaning of Life. Really, really good read, admirably short, brisk,
yes,
but with a lot of fascinating data, and clearly a lot of your own life's work has gone into this, including the work of paring it down to this accessible form.
Thank you, because it was really hard to make it short.
yeah, no, there's you know, the old joke saying it would have been shorter if I had had more time.
Yes,
about a piece of writing. So it's Paul Froese, for those people listening and not watching, Froese. And thanks so much, Paul, and maybe you can come back and talk to us down the road.
Would love to.
All right, take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.